let's talk about gender affirmation policies in schools, because I have a question about it. I'll get to the question shortly, but first let's discuss what gender affirmation policy is. It is the policy where a school will automatically socially transition or affirm a child who has self-identified as a sex other than the one their parents registered for school. Typically, it's other than the sex they were born, their biological sex. All that needs to happen with these gender affirmation policies is for the student to self-identify. That's it. The social transition process begins. The teachers, the counselors, everybody at the school, all the adults will immediately, without asking any questions, recognize and treat that child as that opposite sex or non-binary. That means changing pronouns, changing names, possibly allowing them to change into different clothes, sometimes from a transition closet that they might maintain at school, sometimes just allowing the child to change into different clothes they brought from home, whatever the case. What goes along with these policies, typically, is an implicit or explicit agreement with the child, even children as young as 6, to not tell their parents. To not tell their parents. Keep it a secret. There are some stories now coming out where parents were unaware for years, and their children were pretty far down the social transition path. By the time the parents found out, sometimes they had already been medicalized because counselors and other people had gotten involved and helped the child gain access to hormones and other treatments. What that means is the school and these other adults have concretized a delusion. What do I mean by that? Well, if a child says, remember, there's a minor child. These are human beings who do not have a fully developed prefrontal cortex. They do not have the capacity for reason, and they certainly are terrible forward thinkers and planners. They don't think long term. And they're really subject to peer pressure and environmental pressures, and their desire to belong and fit in is acute, especially in the adolescent time period of like middle school and early high school. It is one of their number one goals is to fit in socially. So you have to worry about things like social contagion. So when there are flags everywhere for inclusion and constant discussion about trans rights and lots of affirmation in general going on and celebration of what they call a community of LGBTQIA+, etc., it is not that far-fetched to think a child could internalize some discomfort they're feeling that is pretty typical at this age anyway, and say, this is what my problem is. Now, that's especially likely if adults are helping them arrive at that conclusion with helpful suggestions like, have you thought about your gender identity, or what is your gender identity? Sometimes simply asking the question, what are your pronouns, puts the doubt in the child's mind that they're certain of their gender identity. Now, when they don't tell the parents and they go ahead and affirm the child, they deny the parents any ability to intercede on the child's behalf and get them help for any kind of comorbid conditions like ADD, autism spectrum disorders, or other mental illnesses that might be showing up, like eating disorders, bipolar disorder, even schizoid personality disorder and schizophrenia that tend to show up in adolescence and early adulthood. So the parent has no window into what's going on at school as far as their child's mental health. That part's a secret. And the child has self-identified as something that is socially celebrated, not just accepted, celebrated. So whatever the discomfort was, if it might have been less celebrated, like they have, thoughts that are consistent with suicidal ideation, bipolar disorder, obsessive compulsive disorder, who knows, any depression, it's a lot easier to say, I'm trans or I'm non-binary or whatever, and be celebrated and surrounded with love and community than it is to say, I don't know what the heck is wrong with me, but I don't feel right in my body on this planet. And then the parent could help them, right? So they don't get to help them get what they really need from a psychotherapist, and they are cut off from their child. They're missing out on this important part of their child's development, even if it is true. So let's say this is a child who will grow up and as an adult will conclude that their gender dysphoria is so severe they need to medicalize it and so forth. the parent is still missing out on that whole part of their adolescence. They're not able to help. They're not able to support them properly unless and until the child says, please tell my mom and dad. And generally speaking, the children who would do that are the ones where the parents were the instigators, not the teachers. That happens too. Why would a child not want their parent to be told? Well, the assumption is, every time I've asked about it, the assumption is, well, the child doesn't want mom and dad to know because mom and dad will reject them. Mom and dad won't like it. Mom and dad will be abusive. Mom and dad won't support them. And to which I say, where would they get that idea? Where would they get the idea that mom and dad will think this is a problem? Could it possibly be from teachers and other folks at school who say, don't worry, we won't tell your parents, we'll keep it confidential if you don't want us to tell them? That puts the idea in their head that maybe this is something that their parents won't want to know. Usually, psychotherapists will tell patients it's really important, especially when they're minors, it's really important that we try to help your parents through this process with you because you need to have a close relationship with your parents. You would not triangulate with the parents. You would, even if they're the worst parents on earth, you know that child has to go home to those parents every day, and it's probably not good for their overall stress and mental well-being to be harboring secrets. Never mind harboring secrets they share with other adults outside the home. That makes them vulnerable to, let's just say, not the best intended people. So my question is, if there's sincerity to this fear that the parents will be abusive, if teachers, counselors, etc. are inclined not to tell because they're worried about abuse, why would they not just report abuse? And wouldn't they need evidence for that? You see, to start an investigation to implicate parents in, a case of abuse, you would need evidence. And yet, they are acting in an extreme way to keep a secret about a child's mental health, a minor child's mental health, possibly as young as 6, from parents on the presumption that the parents either are abusive or will abuse. That means if they're sincere, they're withholding a report that could protect that child from abuse. They're mandatory reporters. I don't want to give them any ideas because, again, they need evidence to engage child protective services. But if they are disinclined to do that, if they know they don't have any evidence of abuse, but for what a child says they're afraid might happen, mom and dad are going to be angry. Angry's not abuse. Not accepting what a child is telling you is also not abuse. Kids make stuff up all the time. They lie. They invent things. They have delusions. That is not a reason for other adults to concretize those delusions and make them sound like facts so that the kid is now living this out and mom and dad are in the dark. In fact, one could argue that is abusive. Triangulating is abusive. Projecting adult wishes onto a child can be perceived as abusive depending on what happens next. If it leads the child to self-harm, like taking sterilizing cross-sex hormones, then yeah, that could be interpreted as abusive manipulation, enticement to self-harm. And they're leaving the parents out of the conversation on the theory the parents might abuse the child. I'm not buying it. I'm not buying it. And as I said, I'm not buying it because if they were really worried about abuse, they would start an investigation. They would get the social worker, the school social worker, the school counselor, they would have a discussion and they would decide if they needed to investigate the home of this child. And you know what's really sad is they are letting that slide for kids who just want to talk about sex a lot. So that's their excuse for comprehensive sex education too. The kids are coming to us with lots of detailed questions about sex. Well, guess what is a sign of abuse? A young child who has lots and lots of very detailed questions about sex. Doesn't mean there is abuse, but it can be a sign. You might want to look for some risk factors. If they're that deeply curious about explicit sexual behavior and they are young, too young to know the words, too young to really be seeing porn accidentally, etc., that's a warning sign. That's not a sign to teach them more about sex. In fact, you could be making the abuse worse because you're desensitizing them to what really ought to be taboo. If something is going on at home with a relative or a family friend or something like that, and maybe even the parents don't know about it, caregiver who is at home, all you're doing is normalizing whatever's being done instead of seeing their curiosity as a cry for help. So the thrust of my questions, plural, today about gender affirmation policy, and then of course the comprehensive sex ed policy, is why are they not using the processes in place for mandatory reporters if they genuinely believe that these families are abusive and that is why they need to be cut out of the process? My answer is they're full of crap. They're not really worried, because if they were, they would report it.